Okay. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. I've got everyone minimized on my screen, but I do see that we've got some people here in the room, so thank you for coming out. I've also got the chat right in front of me, so if anyone has questions I want to ask at any time, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll try and get to those. Otherwise, I might plow through this presentation too quick. We can't have that. Rather have a discussion. Title of this is Show, Don't Tell. I've really, since college, I have been off and on writing. I was a prolific author of first chapters for a very long time. I started seriously writing about maybe 12 or 13 years ago. Got so much into it that I actually started a writers group at the Hoover Library that I understand is still going to this day because I get their emails constantly. So if you're in the Hoover area, join the Write Club. During all this time, we're always learning as writers, and the most common advice from the early days, I would show my work to people, or I read things online, and people always say, "You're writing, show, don't tell, show, don't tell," and it was the most annoying piece of advice ever, because no one who gave that advice was ever very clear about what they were saying. They were telling, show, don't tell, but they weren't showing, show, don't tell. So the question in my mind was, what does that even mean? So I did an awful lot of research so I could tell you or show you what that actually means in your writing, and how to translate that into the written word. Like I said, I started seriously writing about 12, 13 years ago. I quit my librarian job a couple years ago, first, as we were talking about before the panel started, so I could travel the world for a year, and also, since we came back, so I could write full time. Brief personal advertisement, I'll keep this short. I've got several books that you can find online. Summer Gothic was actually a collection of short stories by authors from the Hoover Library Write Club and several other writers groups in North Alabama that we edited and published back in 2012. There's a collection of my own short fiction that's appeared in various magazines and anthologies called The Unwinding House and Other Stories. And there is my pulp time travel novel, The Whisper, which is just for this weekend at the low, low price of $1.99 in ebook. So there you go. But enough of my yakking. Like I said, I was a librarian, so I'm going to be talking all these things. I want to show you where I got a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about today. So, even though I'm not being paid to be a librarian, I cannot stop recommending books. So I'm going to give you a list of books for reading material. Writing Fiction for Dummies by Randy Ingermanson and Peter Economy. Randy Ingermanson's online articles were actually very useful to me when I started writing and finishing a novel for the first time. So the advice he gives in that book is also fantastic. Here's a classic, Strunk and White's Elements of Style. Very thin book, but just about punctuation, grammar, word usage. These are the basics, and there's a bunch of style manuals out there that you can read, but this one's very thin and very clear. And it has one of my favorite writing commandments of all time. One sentence in here: omit needless words. We say that again: omit needless words. And that's going to get us a long way. Here's one that was recommended by Hugo Award-winning editor and author Lou Anders, called My Story Can Beat Up Your Story by Jeffrey Allen Schechter. This is a plot constructing, character building, novel outlining. Well, it's actually aimed for screenplays, but everything in here is good for constructing a novel plot as well. And because all of our first drafts always stink, Self-Editing for Fiction Writers by Rennie Brown and Dave King. If you want to have one novel takeaway or one book writing takeaway from this whole thing, this one. This is my 5-star A+ rate, Self-Editing for Fiction Writers by Rennie Brown, Brown with an E, and Dave King. The last one I'm going to bring up is one that I'm reading right now. I'm only about a third of the way through it, but we're always learning as writers, so we always want to keep up on the trade. And this is Steering the Craft by Ursula Le Guin. And I'm going to be reading and quoting from here today because she speaks to some of the things I want to speak to. So we're writing fiction. What is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish in writing fiction? Is it to tell stories? Is it to explicate a bunch of characters? Is it to like describe how events go from A to B to C and D? No. Those are the tools that we use. Those are the pieces of fiction. That's what goes into making it. But the actual goal, what we're trying to accomplish with our fiction, is to give our readers a powerful emotional experience. That's what we're going for. How we do it might be a cleverly constructed plot or richly detailed characters, but those are just the tools to get to the emotional payoff. Because what the reader is going after in the end isn't to see how clever your plot is or how richly detailed your backstory is or how much thought you went into creating the characters. The reader is after the emotional experience your story is going to provide them. For romance fans, this is the thrill of a relationship that is born, goes through troubles, and solidifies into something. For science fiction and fantasy fans, it's the feel of the exotic, the sense of wonder, just what it's like to explore an alien world or alien place or alien way of being. For horror novels or thrillers, it's that sense of adrenaline. It's that feeling of being on edge that you get from a roller coaster. For even for what we call literary fiction, which we have another panel today to talk about that, but it's just, you know, the emotion, like you're going for like some kind of a truly authentic emotional human experience translated through prose. And you don't get these things by explaining a story to someone. You get these things by using your words to trick people into thinking or feeling that the story is happening to them, that they are living through it. And the tools that we're going to call showing are tools that let you perform this magic trick. They're the tools that let you slip past your reader's defenses and invoke an emotional response to them. The tools that we're going to call telling, which on the surface are the easier tools to use to make a story, get in the way of doing that magic trick. The tools we're going to call telling are the ones that show off you as the writer instead of letting you be the man behind the curtain while the great and powerful Oz does his stuff. So what is telling? What do we call telling? So we have an example. Telling is anytime you have a narrative summary or synopsis. If you read the blurb on the back of a book that says what the book is about, that's telling. And that's okay in that context, although it's got to be snappy. But anytime a story stops in the middle of a book and becomes like an encyclopedia article, that's what we call telling. A recent, and I felt pretty egregious example of this in best-selling science fiction, was the final volume in Cixin Liu's trilogy of books that began with the three-body problem. The first book was really interesting. The second book, The Dark Forest, was, I thought, fantastic. The third book really went off the rails, I felt, because the author had so many ideas that he wanted to explain in such vivid detail that he would stop and listen to this on audio. So he would stop the story for what felt like an hour, hour and a half at a time to have encyclopedia articles on information about the future world he'd created. And it was interesting, but it wasn't story. There was no emotional context to it. So he was telling. He just so much he wanted to get out there and show off that he was just telling. Cixin Liu could get away with this because he'd already written some best-selling novels and people would buy anything he wrote at this point. As a new author starting off, you're not going to be able to get away with that. I'm sorry to say. You are telling when you have passages in the book that have no setting, no characters, and no dialogue. If you like have a, for instance, if you were writing a legal thriller and there's a passage in the book where you start to explain some point of law and maybe the history of the point of law, it's a very interesting point of law, but if it's not in the context of a setting, characters, dialogue, then you're just telling some law to us. It might be interesting, it might not, but it's not advancing the story. It's not giving us an emotional connection to something going on because nothing's going on. It's just an encyclopedia article. So in contrast to that, what is showing? What is the show we're supposed to do? You're showing when you describe an immediate scene. Something is happening in a place with characters and there's action. That is showing. You describe the setting in some way. Maybe not exhaustively, because that can lead you down the telling rabbit hole, but you give us some details to invoke the scene in our mind. You're in a bar and there's a little bit of light coming through this dirty glass that gives everything a yellow cast, or you're in a church for a wedding scene and the characters are overwhelmed from the smell from all the fresh flowers they've strewn about the place. Just some little details to show us where we are. Characters speak. We don't get like a summary or synopsis of a conversation that happened. We get the actual words and the actual voices coming out of the characters' mouths. Actions take place. You're in the church I just described, and the preacher says, does anyone have just cause why these two should not be married? And someone charges in the back door and says, oh, you bet I do. Things actually take place in real time. It's the next point. When you're showing the events take place in real time, they're not described as if this is all after the fact. Even if you're talking in even if your book is written in past tense, as most are, the events are taking place and chronicled as they occur in real time, with no foreknowledge of what's about to happen because of them, or like pause to explain the cause of what came before. We're seeing as it happened, and we're drawing the connections from A to B to C. Now, this is all like for the scenes and action, but what about individual characters? Because our emotional connection is not going to be through the events themselves, the places themselves, but through the characters that we connect with and identify with and kind of flesh out with pieces of ourselves as we read. So we want to show character instead of telling character. So if we're telling character, if you're writing a story and you tell the character and show it, one example is this, is if you give a bunch of details about the character before they even walk on stage. Before the character even shows up and takes an action or utters a line of dialogue, we get a paragraph or a page describing who they are, giving their life history, explaining who they are. So we don't get a chance as readers to get to know these people as friends or enemies or whatever, but we're instead handed like a resume. This is this character. These are all the facts about them. This is why they have a limp. And also you're telling character when you present already conclusions about the character, what kind of person they are, what they like to do. Are they a good person? Are they a bad person? Are they honest? Are they a liar? Are they ethical? Are they a creep? If you give us this information and these conclusions about the character without letting the reader draw these conclusions on their own, then you're telling the character and not showing the character for who they are. So, how do you show a character instead of taking a shortcut and telling us all about them? When you show a character, their personalities emerge from action, their reactions, and in dialogue. So instead of telling us character X is a creep, you write a scene in which they show up and they say something creepy, or they do something creepy, or other characters react to this person in a way that shows that they are creeped out. You do all this without actually saying the word creepy, but you allow the reader to experience this character as if they just walked in the door, and give all the cues in the character's actions and how they react and the things the characters say to let the reader make those conclusions about the character and decide, do we like this person? Do we not like them? Do we trust them? Do we not trust them? Is this someone that we would let in the front door of our house, or is this someone that we would run screaming from as soon as we had like 5 words conversation? So in other words, you want to let the readers make up their own minds about what kind of person the character is. Especially, and I say this is true, the more important the character is to the story, the more you want to hold back your authorial opinions and knowledge about who the character is, and how much you want to let the readers intuit on their own. Take mystery genre, for example. This is you don't want to give away the bag about who done it, so you want to hold back as much information as you can. I mean, for me, when I write, even though I write science fiction, I write fantasy, and I write horror, I write all my characters as if I'm writing a mystery novel. The example I was using, an author who's been in trouble lately and who upset a bunch of friends of mine with some comments she made. However, the book is a prime example of this, and the one is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Throughout that book, the author shows us the character of Severus Snape. I'm assuming that we're well past the statute of limitations on spoilers for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, so I can talk about that. She shows us one aspect of Severus Snape and his character that makes him the obvious choice for the evil whodunit bad guy in the book, and that lets her pull the bait and switch. And we've already said, I don't trust this person, and then we makes the further revelations about his character later on in the book and in the series more powerful, because instead of telling us things about the character, we drew our own conclusions about the character, and they all ended up being the wrong conclusions or incomplete conclusions. So let me see. Let me move on here. Like I was saying, details about characters should be established gradually and unobtrusively. Sneak them in through the dialogue, through mannerisms, through their attitudes, and through the actions they take and the emotions they display and feel. So now we get to the crux of my argument, which is about emotion. Like I've been saying, the whole goal of the process of showing and not telling is to do the magic trick where you invoke emotions in the readers themselves and not simply just in the characters in the story. So to do that, you have to show the emotion and not simply tell it. So we talk about telling emotion. What's a tell when you're telling emotion? Name the emotion. If you say it outright. Someone was afraid. Well, you've told us the character is afraid, but you haven't invoked fear in the reader by doing that. In fact, you kind of like showed that the rabbit was already in the hat before you pulled the rabbit out of the hat. Another thing that tells emotion is to explain the emotion. It's not just, and this goes back to explaining, drawing conclusions on the reader's behalf, is you name the emotion the character's feeling and then explain in detail why the character would feel that way. You're doing the reader's work for them, and you're taking away some of the joy of reading and figuring those things out on themselves by handing it on a silver platter. Make your readers work for it. The more the readers intuit the emotions of the story, and the more the readers work out for themselves why a character is feeling this way, the more of themselves they're going to invest in the story and invest in the character. Think about the movie Inception. In the movie, I'm not going to spoil, but the premise of the movie is they want to go into someone's mind and implant an idea in such a way that the person is going to think that this idea was their own. This is what you want to do as a writer. You have to incept an emotion in the reader, but if you do it the obvious way and name the emotion and explain it, the reader knows that you're putting the idea there. But if you just set up a scene and describe the character and let the reader fill in the gaps with the logical emotional conclusions, they're the one who's coming to the conclusion. They're the one who's deducing the emotion and the explanations behind it. So therefore they have ownership of that emotion. It's theirs. And you've done the magic trick. You've incepted the emotion. So to show emotion, you've been talking about, you're going to evoke the feeling you wish to describe in your reader, not in the character, in the reader. Use action, dialogue, and physical sensation to convey the emotion. You know, not the words themselves, because you're going to give your reader an experience, not information. So the example I used the first time I ever did this talk was, you know, you could write, the sheriff was sitting in the boat, the shark jumped out of the water, the sheriff was very afraid. I've given you information, but not giving you experience. But if I was to write, and not make this a movie like it is, of course, but if I was to write this and instead just describe the sheriff's frame of mind as he's sitting there in the boat, annoyed, irritated, feeling he's wasting his time, I describe the shark lunging out of the water and his mouth is like bigger than the guy's body, and describe the sheriff stands up, describe the sheriff's physical reaction, his eyes like go wide, and he slowly backs away from where he saw the shark and says to the captain, "We're going to need a bigger boat." Without once mentioning how the sheriff feels, you can show how the sheriff feels, show the fear, and scare the reader in the process. So these are broad scopes of the tools that we talk about telling, and the tools we talk about showing. And now we're going to talk about some specifics as far as the little nitty-gritty about what to watch out for. I call this know your enemy. Adverbs. Let me give some quotes from authority figures who speak with more weight than me. Mark Twain said, "When you see an adverb, kill it." Stephen King said, "The road to hell is paved with adverbs." And I say, "Most adverbs are redundant," she whispered quietly. So we could remove a word from that sentence and not lose anything. And really, we could expand this to adverbs and adjectives and modifiers in general as words that tend to weaken prose and tend to get in the way of what you're trying to show. So let's just define people who've been a long time since high school grammar. Adverb is any word used to modify a verb. So he walked quickly. He talked silently. These words usually end in "ly." Adjectives, of course, are any word used to modify a noun. A short goat, a black sail, a fast turtle. A noun, you have a word to describe it in some way. Now, probably saying, hold on, you cannot write without using these words. Of course not. We're going to use these words. And I was just, yesterday, I came across a passage in this book, Steering the Craft by Ursula K. Le Guin, where instead of, and she writes this beautifully, so I'm just going to read this because I can't do it better, but she describes adverbs and adjectives less like forces of evil, which is kind of extreme, and more like donuts. She says, and this is from chapter 5, adjectives and adverbs are rich and good and nourishing. They add color, life, immediacy. They cause obesity in prose only when used lazily or overused. Where the quality that the adverb indicates can be put in the verb itself, instead of "they ran quickly," say "they raced," or the quality of the adjective can be put into the noun itself, instead of "a growling voice," say "a growl," the prose will be cleaner, more intense, and more vivid. So when we're using these adjectives and adverbs, let me go to see. We're usually doing it to bolster a weak verb, a verb that doesn't have all the meaning we're trying to convey. So we tack an adverb onto it. So like, spoke might be a weak verb if he spoke quietly. But then again, instead of saying spoke quietly, we could say whispered. That's a stronger verb because the verb gives more information. So instead whenever possible, if you have a verb that you feel a need to modify with an adverb, whenever possible, look for a different word where you don't need the adverb that gives all the information at once. So like moved quickly, ran. To know if you're overusing adverbs, when we do that for adverbs and adjectives, we also tend to use common ones that we've heard in the same context. So when we're overusing adverbs and adjectives, also usually sign that our writing isn't very original, that we're parroting phrases, like whole phrases that we've heard before. The quick brown fox and the lazy dog, you know. So what's a tool that we can use to show in terms of the actual words and word choices? Action. Let's talk about action here. Action always shows. It never tells. If you're describing an action taking place, you are showing the reader something that is going on. Not if you're giving a summary, but if you're giving us the action as it takes place so we can watch it play out in front of us in our mind's eye, that is showing. However, these actions are only going to matter when they involve characters the reader cares about. So you have to show us the characters in order for the action to carry the weight you want. And the actions don't have to be big to carry emotional weight. Sometimes the action is big, like Jules pulls out the gun in Pulp Fiction and shoots the guy on the couch. But the action can also be small, as in the way before that Jules just walks into the room with a smile on his face and tells the guy on the couch, stay calm, keep chilling. Small actions like the way a character eats their food. Small actions like the way a character walks. There's a fantastic series of novels by Joe Abercrombie that begin with, I forget. It's one of the books is The Blade Itself, but I don't think that's the first one. But anyway, there's a character in the whole series with a pronounced limp. And that limp is used to show the character and what they're like and what their life is like and go through. Small action, but it carries a lot of weight in the story. Actions speak louder than words. The things that characters do and what takes place in action is going to have more impact than what they say. Specifically, if a character's actions contradicts his dialogue, the readers are going to believe the action. So when you're revealing character and you have a character who's a lying snake, that's fine. You show through the actions who the character actually is rather than their words or telling the readers, this person's a lying snake. Have them say one thing, have them do another. More tools for showing. Dialogue. There's several kinds of dialogue that we can use to show. So the first most obvious is direct dialogue. This is where you're quoting the exact words that come out of the character's mouth. You give us their word choice, their attitude, You can show us the inflection, although I kind of warn against trying to write dialect by changing spellings, but through like word choice and the way they present themselves and where they put the pauses in sentence, you show us a lot about the character. There's indirect dialogue. When we talk about indirect dialogue, we're talking about dialogue that gives a gist of the words. Instead of saying word for word, everything coming up, you said, Susie said that, and you give a gist of all the things Susie said in a certain brief part of the conversation. But you have summary dialogue where you summarize an entire conversation. When you summarize an entire conversation in narrative form. Remember, summaries are telling, but sometimes, and we'll get to this in a minute, where you're going to want to tell, you'll do this to just move the story along, especially if what's involved in a certain section isn't so important or isn't going to reveal much. To summarize, we're talking about tools for showing here. Direct dialogue is going to show the most. Indirect dialogue, somewhere in between. It's kind of a shorthand. Summary dialogue, you're going back into telling mode, and you're just need to move the story along, and we're going to tell what happened in this conversation, because hearing the whole thing is going to drag it down. So we use dialogue to advance the conflict of the story. Everyone hates a novel when you read characters and their conversations are telling each other things they already know just so that the reader can hear it. You know, when characters have their own personalities, their own points of view, even if they're not enemies, they're going to have their own points of view, their own agendas that are different from each other. So there's going to be some conflict in a dialogue, and that conflict is what moves the story along. We use the dialogue to give each character a voice. How they speak, what words they choose to use. Are they very terse? Do they speak in monosyllables or very short sentences, or are they someone who love the sound of their own voice and suck up all the oxygen in the room because they can't stop talking or let anyone else in? This shows us a lot about who the character is. And to keep your reader reading and caring, you keep the dialogue off balance and unpredictable. You do this by trying to avoid cliches and catchphrases that you've heard a million times before. Don't necessarily run to the thesaurus and use words that no one in the right mind would ever use in conversation, but just remember that your characters are unique people with their own points of view and their own agendas and their own wants and desires is going to conflict, and just bat these up again against each other, and you've got a poker game, you've got a chess game, you've got some bit of conflict that'll keep the dialogue interesting and off kilter just a little bit. And of course, in your dialogues, you use attribution tags, you know, he said, she said, John said, but in general, avoid the fancy ones. He exclaimed, she shouted, she revealed. As authors, we get tired of writing the word said over and over and over and over again. And we think it's repetitious, we think it's boring, and we think we could just get so much more in here if we put, you know, some fancier word. I can't believe that just happened, he exhaled. But that's about as pernicious as the adjectives and adverbs that are used unnecessarily. It's the author showing off the author and presenting conclusions. If there's something that you need to get across, put it in the dialogue and the word choice itself. Readers, to a reader, the words he said, she said, they said, we said, it's almost invisible. It's like a punctuation mark. You don't notice the periods, you don't notice the commas, you don't notice the question marks unless they're in the wrong place. So don't necessarily shy away from just sticking with said unless there's a really, really good reason to go with something else. Okay, other things that are going to show your character and emotion. We have interior emotion. Interior emotion, we describe the internal physiological sensations that are felt while in the grip of strong emotions. instead of just telling us someone is angry. If you're trying to invoke this emotion, instead you will describe how their face warms up, how the right words will catch in their throat, how they might just feel some kind of knot forming in their stomach. Having said that, watch out for the cliches. Knot in stomach. If it's been used a lot, try to go for some other response. One that I see an awful lot in the works I kind of critique for others is gritting the teeth. He grit his teeth, and yeah, okay, that's showing an internal psychological response. But I remember one night with my writers group, we're going over everyone's stories, and in about a third, at least a third of the excerpts we reviewed and critiqued that night, there were characters gritting their teeth, and I was like, guys, do all of our characters need a dentist? So interior emotion, these interior responses are things that you're going to want to use to show the emotion and invoke the emotion without actually telling what the emotion is. But a little goes a long way. Don't overdo it, or the reader might think that instead of feeling emotions, your character is having some kind of a gastrointestinal crisis, and we don't want that either. A rule for interior emotion is that you can only use it for the point of view character. Okay, if you're telling the story from the point of view of Dr. Watson, watching Sherlock Holmes solve a case, Dr. Watson doesn't know anything that's going on inside Sherlock Holmes. So Dr. Watson can't tell us about the interior physical sensation that Sherlock Holmes is feeling, or any of the other characters who Sherlock Holmes is deducing from. Only the point of view character do you get to use this tool. And you're going to focus mainly on involuntary responses. These are the things you cannot help when they happen, and that this is the action that gives away what the character is feeling. It just invokes it. And because we as human beings, unless we're sociopaths, we've felt all these things before, we can deduce from a fluttering of the heart that someone is excited because of the little meet cute that just happened, or we can deduce from someone not being able to breathe that they might be about to go in a state of panic. And therefore we're putting part of ourself in the character, we're investing in the character, and that emotion is being incepted into our head. Like I said before, don't overuse. A little goes a long way. If you overuse this technique, then it becomes obvious to the reader that you are overusing it, and it becomes what we call purple prose, is overdoing it. I just heard more thunder here in Atlanta, so hopefully they won't knock me out again. Another tool for showing interior monologue. It's a good thing that most writers are introverts, and we know what interior monologue is because we have them. But interior monologue refers to the actual thoughts of your point of view character. You know, this is the actual words going through the POV character's mind as things are happening around them, and the point of view character is making deductions or reacting to things without making a physical action or without speaking to it, but they just realize something and they have to say it to themselves. Interior monologue, you have the same three distinction as dialogue. There's the direct interior monologue, which is word for word what's going on in the character's mind. But you do not use attribution tags. We'll do this like, well, isn't that interesting, he thought. Don't do the he thought. If we're doing it if you're in this character's head, then everything that we're reading is something that's going on in their head. And if you phrase it, and one stylistic choice we usually make is to put one of these quotes in italics instead of quotation marks. But if you're already deep inside a point of view character's head, then everything we're reading is something that's going on interior to them. So if it's word for word dialogue, then we just know this is an internal thought of the character. There's the indirect, where you give us a general sense of what the character is thinking, and there's just a narrative summary of like what your main character thought about this conversation they just had or this adventure they just had with their sickly aunt after the whole thing's over with. You always use the present tense for direct interior monologue, because the direct interior monologue is like dialogue. And unless we're speaking to someone and telling a story of something that happened yesterday, if we're talking about what's going on right now with someone, we always speak in present tense. Therefore, for direct interior monologue, we always think in present tense. And one last point here about interior monologue that's important to remember is a character cannot lie to the reader in interior monologue. A character can be mistaken, but a character cannot lie to the reader, because when you're in the interior monologue of the character, this is what the character is thinking to themselves. And it's they can be deceiving themselves, but they cannot lie to the reader, because that's just, well, it's no fair on the author's part. And it's what you're doing as author is putting your reader in the character's mind, so you're thinking what the character is thinking. The character does not know that there is a reader, so the character is just thinking these thoughts. So you cannot lie directly to the reader in the interior monologue. But as I said, the way out there is the character can be mistaken. Harry Potter thought for a long time that Severus Snape was the bad guy who was trying to get the Sorcerer's Stone. And so on his interior monologue, that's exactly what he thought. He wasn't lying to the reader, he was just wrong. Tools for showing. Description. This is when you create a word picture of an environment, everything around. Let's see, hour's coming up, so I'll move through here. When you're describing a scene, remember to show only what the point of view character can see or hear, etc. Now, if you don't have a point of view character, if you have what we call omniscient voice, where the person or the voice narrating the book is like looking down from on high and describing, then you can describe everything. But in that voice, if you don't have a POV character, you're not really showing the emotionality of anybody, and therefore you're kind of in telling mode at that point. So in your description, show only what the point of view character can see or hear, etc. This is especially why I love working in first person, where it's I saw this, I heard that, I smelled this. It really forces me as a writer to focus just on the sensations that my character is experiencing. And like I said before, use strong nouns and verbs rather than adjectives when possible. If you have to use an adjective, go ahead. But if you can use a noun that conveys everything or a verb that conveys everything in itself, use that. And instead of describing everything in minute detail and writing an encyclopedia article to set up the scene, just pick a few concrete details that imply the many details you aren't showing. I remember reading a passage from, I think it was Madame Bovary, which was arguably the first modern novel in the term that we would call it. And there's like one scene of a forest, and the only thing the author Gustave Flaubert describes is the way the light flickers through the leaves. And from that one concrete detail, we can extrapolate everything else in the forest. Stephen King says this too. He says, good description usually consists of a few well-chosen details that will stand for everything else. So let me see. So in the description, we're going to use the POV character's senses without directly referring to the POV character unless we have to. We're seeing through their eyes. We're already in their head, so we can intuit everything we're seeing is through their head. So we're going to filter the description through the mind and emotions of the point of view character. So, that is that we're going to so that through describing the scene this way, we're going to show the character, because we're going to reveal the point of view character's attitude about whatever it is they're looking at through how they react, how they interpret, how they feel about what they see when you describe the scene. So yeah, And not only this, but we can also reveal characters themselves by the way they appear in the story. Running out of time here, so just a quick little run through about telling and the fact that sometimes you should. It's a novice writer. When we first start out, we're going to tell an awful lot more than we should. We're going to tell everything. When we graduate and we become intermediate journeyman writers, then we kind of overshow. We show everything. We show. We figured out what showing means, and we do that all the time. The master writer, the excellent writer, the good pro writer knows how to balance the two, when to tell, when to show. So we use narrative summary and telling to summarize events that happen over a stretch of time. You can write 100,000 words about how the characters get from point A to point B, but if what happens at point A and what happens at point B are the only things that are important, we can skip the middle bit, narrative summary, to get there. We can use exposition to explain a set of facts. Like I said, if you're writing a legal thriller, you're going to want to explain that point of law at some point. So you will use telling to explain a set of facts about here's this law, here's why this way, here's the implication. And we'll use telling to describe the scene, a person, or thing outside from a character's POV. When we go to that omniscient voice and you need to just explain how like a scene is before we get into a character's head, that's when you're going to tell. When to tell is when you need to give your reader information quickly and efficiently. We need to do this to compress things that aren't going to advance the story, but that the reader just has to know for the next thing to make sense. You will tell to adjust the pacing of the story, because you don't want to overload your reader with emotions all the time. You got to give them space to breathe. And one way to give your reader space to breathe is to just back up and tell something to illustrate a point or set up the next scene, but you shift into. So if you want to give like your horror reader a few breaths between panic attacks, you can back up and explain some of the history and architecture of these ancient ruins before the next horde of zombies come out. So I kind of rushed through the end, but apologize for my internet outage on this end. And that's our hour, but if we have any last questions, please shoot them to me in the group chat. Thank y'all for listening. I hope everyone who views this on the stream enjoys it, gets something out of it. And you can find me online at Jared Millet, that's Jared, like the jewelry store, millet.blogspot.com, and on Facebook, just look up my name, Jared Millet, author, and you will find me. And thank you for your time. I hope you got something out of this Zoom session, and enjoy the rest of the convention.